Let's move on to some of the most interesting news playing out right now, especially in New York's 16th district, where Jamaal Bowman lost his race pretty handily. Double-digit loss for squad member Jamaal Bowman. And Ryan, I think maybe we just run through some of these results quickly, and then we want to get, I am especially curious to hear what you have to say about what happened to Jamaal Bowman and AIPAC and all of that up in New York 16th. But also Lauren Boebert did win that district in Ken Buck's, it was Ken Buck's old seat. The Trump-backed candidate in Utah to replace Mitt Romney lost handily. It was like a 20-point loss.
Love Romney.
20, yeah, but Trump, I mean, this is not, there was a conversation last week we were talking about Bob Good getting booted from his seat. He's the chairman of the Freedom Caucus. We interviewed him a couple of months ago. And people were saying, well, it was the Trump factor. Trump weighed in for his opponent, and that's what did him in. Really mixed bag with Trump endorsements in recent result history. And last night was absolutely no exception to that. So those are, I think, a few of the big ones. We might touch on a couple of other ones going forward here, but let's start with Bowman, Ryan. Big loss. And
so George Latimer finishes, they're still counting a little bit, but he's creeping in on 59%, 58, 59%, which is about what the polls were showing. Like people expected this was going to be a landslide. Daniel Marins, my old colleague over at the Huffington Post, has a really good kind of rundown of this race that gets into the retail political, I don't know if you want to call them mistakes that Bowman made over the last couple of years, because mistakes implies that he didn't do it on purpose. Like what Bowman in 2021 took a trip sponsored by J Street to visit Israel. And J Street had endorsed him in 2020 against Eliot Engel.
Obviously a pro-Israel group.
It's a pro-Israel, but it's liberal Zionist group. It's kind of, they fight with AIPAC a lot. And in 2020 and 2022 in particular, they were kind of a leading element of the coalition that was fighting back against AIPAC, while AIPAC was spending millions of dollars trying to take out like squad-like members. In 2020, Bowman came in, DMFI, which was the kind of proto-AIPAC super PAC, spent about $2 million against Bowman, trying to buck up Eliot Engel, who was the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, and one of the leading Israel hawks in Congress. And so for Engel to go down was a huge deal. And despite that $2 million in spending, Bowman beat him. Israel-Palestine wasn't a huge part of the race at the time. It was what drove the funding, but it wasn't what drove the kind of public conversation about the race. Remember, this was the height of the George Floyd protests.
Right.
And Eliot Engel had this absolutely monumental gaffe where he went to a George Floyd rally and he was caught on an open mic trying to speak. And the guy running the rally is like, look, so many elected officials here. We're not letting everybody speak. It's hot out here. We'll be here all day. And he said, I wouldn't ask if I didn't have a primary. I wouldn't even be here if I didn't have a primary.
Nailed it.
And it was on the hot mic. It was on New York One. It's like, wow. And it fed into, that's a tone-deaf thing to say at the height of the George Floyd protests. And also, he was caught living in Maryland at the time. Like a reporter went to his door in Maryland and found him there. And they're like, you've been claiming that you've been at these events in New York, but you haven't been in New York at all. He's like, I've been in both places. And there was no evidence he'd been in both places at all. He'd just been in Maryland. So
don't worry about it.
The two things came together, created a big scandal, and Bowman crushed him, even in heavily Jewish precincts. 2021, J Street takes him to Israel. And AIPAC takes lawmakers to Israel on these guided tours every 2 years. Steny Hoyer organizes these trips. They're bipartisan. And they come back fortified in their support for Israel. Jamaal Bowman came back from that trip to Israel a changed person. And he's talked about this. Like seeing the occupation up close in the West Bank, like seeing that Muslims could not, or Palestinians could not, go down certain roads, seeing the fencing. There's this one famous street that has kind of netting over top of the street, and I think it's in Hebron, because so many of the Jewish Israeli settlers there throw trash onto the street from their settlements. So they eventually had to put up a net. highways where you can't drive if you don't have the right license plate. You have to have certain permits to get different areas. He was shocked to his core. And so that's why I say I wouldn't describe the political decisions he made after that as mistakes, because he decided that this was wrong and this was something he was going to stand up for. Now, he did, in the time since then, he did not build inroads into the Jewish community. He did not come to the synagogues, and this is what they say, that he didn't come to the synagogues and have this dialogue with them. He didn't talk to them about his experience that he'd had there. It was more of just a public kind of political campaign that he was running, and that's what he felt was appropriate. But what it did is it drove this wedge, even among, say, the liberals in his district, who might say, you know what, I agree with you, I'm against the occupation, I'm against this and that. They felt like they had just kind of lost touch with him, that he didn't care about that community. And so it's interesting that AIPAC spent nearly $20 million in this race, because his initial race is what basically brought AIPAC into the super PAC game. Like DMFI spending $2 million and losing to Jamaal Bowman convinced AIPAC, okay, DMFI is not cut out for this on its own. Like they're raising $5–10 million a year. We can do much better than that. So that's why they came in 2022 and spent $30, $40, $50 million, and why they came in and spent nearly $20 million just in this race.
Wasn't it 14 the total? Somewhere like 14 point for Bowman this race.
I saw 17, but I don't think we've seen a final number either.
I mean, either way, it is the most expensive race, and all because of AIPAC. It's the most expensive house race in the history of house races.
Yes, it is, and that's including that David Trone, like the total wine guy, who spent like 12 of his own $1 million to finish in third place in one race, and then spent more than like roughly that to finally win. And God knows what he spent to lose his Senate race this year.
I forgot about that.
That's a different question. Yeah, most expensive race in history. But it's also because it's New York. Like buying airtime in New York is insanely expensive. And to blanket the airwaves, especially when you have to buy New York air, but it's like suburban New York that you're actually aiming for, is going to cost you an enormous amount of money.
So interestingly, there was a report in Axios this morning after Bowman, as the dust was kind of clearing, that quoted a House Democrat saying it felt kind of gross, the amount of money that had been spent on the Bowman race. And that like AIPAC, it was this sort of not rebuttal, it was this rebuke almost, off the record, of course. All of these people were talking off the record, but of how AIPAC had handled this race, saying this was too much. It's not even, this is from people who sounded like very supportive of AIPAC, saying this is starting to actually undermine your cause and give people reason to say you're out here putting gross amounts of money to buy races, and it's not feeling like so democratic anymore. It's feeling a little bit like big money.
And if you look at AIPAC's donors, they're mostly Republicans, which bothers Democrats more than the fact that it's AIPAC.
Although not the voters in New York 16.
Well, it's not as if it's not as if the ads say funded by Republican donors who have given money to AIPAC. It says this ad was supported by United Democracy Project. Like, oh, I'm for United Democracies. That sounds great.
Well, I also thought Latimer's messaging was interesting with the way Bowman ran his campaign, where Latimer was saying, I want to end the chaos in Washington, D.C. And then just in the last few days, I'm sure, actually an April poll matched the results that we got last night pretty closely. But you have the chaos, if you're a voter who's just trying to feed your family, take your kids to soccer practice, whatever, looking at Jamaal Bowman like jumping around, saying F AIPAC, whatever else he said. And then a guy, and also the whole fire thing, the 9/11 conspiracy theories, which don't always play so well in New York. And he had walked back, sort of on a parallel track with Marjorie Taylor Greene.
And a lot of anti-Bowman people, to your point about AIPAC's gross amount of spending, are frustrated that AIPAC spent so much money because now they can't make the argument that Bowman was unpopular and that his constituents rejected his brand of politics, fair and square. Like you just can't say that. You can believe it, and I've heard people make a reasonable case that Latimer, absent interventions from either side, might have beaten Jamaal Bowman because of the district that he's running in and the politics around it. But nobody can say that with any confidence because that's not what happened. AIPAC came in and dropped at least, we'll see the final total in the end, but more money than has ever been dropped by any single organization in a congressional race before, and that obviously tilts the scale. And so now it makes it so nobody has to actually talk about the issues at play, and instead both sides can say, look at the sheer amount of money. And from the Democratic side, and we're going to talk about this later in our AIPAC block, it is wild.
This isn't the AIPAC block.
Right. It is wild that Democrats are allowing in Democratic primaries Republican billionaires to funnel so much money into their primaries. It's kind of an incredible situation. And I just don't think Republicans would ever allow that.
I also think progressives, and Cori Bush is well worth talking about in this context. Looks like she might lose her primary.
Tough one. Ilhan Omar's got a tough race.
A nail biter in Minnesota with Ilhan Omar. I think progressives have struggled to connect these really front and center, high-profile discussions about Israel and Palestine to the material concerns of some of their voters who, for whatever reason, and we can all disagree with the reasons, but just don't care as much about the issue as they do domestic
This is the only district where they even talked somewhat about Israel-Palestine.
Right.
When AIPAC runs its ads, even in this district, they were not about Israel-Palestine. Like when they were going after Bowman, they're going after Bowman for not being a loyal enough Democrat, withholding his vote on the infrastructure bill.
I'm sure they dumped that oppo on the 9/11 stuff.
Pulling the fire alarm, and it didn't.
Which he should not have done.
And it doesn't help.
And then he shouldn't have lied about it.
Like he's a principal, and so I think that hurt him because
that wasn't good.
Principals know how fire alarms work.
Yeah, he thought it was the door, is what he said.
And so even AIPAC doesn't run on Israel-Palestine.
Right.
They poll what they think is going to be damaging to their opponent, and then they run on that.
But these candidates, it's the reality they're facing is that it's going to get dragged into the center of the race. Even if AIPAC knows that it's not front and center concerns of voters, media conversation about Cori Bush,
It's the media conversation, but on the ground, so it'll be Wesley Bell versus Cori Bush. The ads are not going to be about Israel-Palestine for the most part.
That's true.
Cori Bush will be talking about how she stood up for the renters and fought against ending the foreclosure moratorium. And
I guess
she's delivered for St. Louis that she's brought back money, like Summer Lee did in Pittsburgh. Whereas Wesley Bell will say, it's too much drama.
Well, that's what I was going to say.
Put a guy like me in.
I think it just plays into the broader narrative of chaos and an extremism. And I do think that progressive Democrats need to find a better way to talk about the issue that neutralizes that. It's just the reality that it's going to be used as something that's...
Summer Lee basically showed how to do that, and Cori Bush is kind of modeling her campaign after Summer Lee. Summer Lee, if you look at her, she's basically a squad member, but if you look at her advertising and her messaging in Pittsburgh, it's indistinguishable from a normal Democrat. And that's to the point that if you have a big turnout in a Democratic primary election, there are a lot of normie Democrats who that's just what they want.
Let's talk about Lauren Boebert. Why not?
Speaking of normies.
Yes. Lauren Boebert won her primary in the Beetlejuice district. Kidding. You remember the Beetlejuice story?
Oh my God, the play.
I'm sorry that I had to remind you of that because the image is indelible. But we have the results from Lauren Boebert's race. This turned out to be a pretty healthy primary win for her. 43 points, though. She didn't get over half because the rest of the vote was split between all of these other candidates. This is Ken Buxell district, as we mentioned, right up at the top. What's very interesting about this situation is that the establishment guy, Jeff Hurd, he won the Republican primary in Lauren Boebert's current district. So the 3rd congressional district, she switched districts feeling like she was going to lose, and she probably would have lost, actually. We don't know, but she probably would have lost from that 3rd district outside Denver to this district, which is, I believe, it's the 4th congressional district. And the establishment guy, not a big MAGA guy, is the one who ended up winning her actual district that she'll be vacating, obviously, and moving over to this new district.
Now in Texas, you have to get over 50% in a primary or you go to a runoff. So if the Republicans in Colorado were running on the Texas primary model, you'd now have a runoff between Boebert and what was her name, Jenny?
Yeah.
The second place candidate there. How do you think that goes? Do you think that there's enough anti-Boebert sentiment in that district that she actually ends up losing, and that she only won because the anti-Boebert vote was split? Or do you think that a decent number of those candidates had as a second choice Boebert, so that she'd win in a primary anyway? Because the point here is that Bowman last year had two opponents.
Yep.
Last election had two opponents, and he got like 54% of the vote. He won comfortably because they split the anti-Bowman vote. But for people watching closely, it was a warning sign.
Right.
Like, oh, you were just 4 percentage points over a majority.
Yeah.
You could have lost that race if there was a single opponent against you. She's only at 43.
She reminds me, her problems remind me of Bowman's in some respect, just thinking about the fire alarm situation and the oppo that was dragged out on his previous sort of poetry blog that dabbled in 9/11 trutherism. It also kind of reminds me of Marjorie Taylor Greene. I made a joke about that earlier. The sort of media double standard aside, I think it's really interesting that people who are like now in Congress were pulled in those directions because I think it's tempting for all of us. And I don't think it's isolated to them. And I think the populism in particular, when you're seeking out explanations for the just rapid changes, deindustrialization, material concerns that have accelerated, it's not crazy to get pulled down in crazy directions. You just have to sort of be vigilant against those things. But I think Lauren Boebert with Jamaal Bowman in that sort of fire alarm versus Beetlejuice situation, they just look ridiculous. And I know Lauren Boebert ran on, she used to own a bar, right? That was like a Second Amendment themed bar, basically like a gun themed bar. I think it was called Shooters, something like that. And
if you like, it had more health code violations than like.
Did it really? It's a sign of a good restaurant. No, But yeah, I mean, I think she just lost a lot of, even as like this populist person.
And to survive, she jumped districts. I wonder what would have happened if Bowman jumped districts and ran against Richie Torres in the Bronx instead.
That's super interesting.
And maybe 2 years from now, that's what he'll do.
I think Boebert probably would have lost, but it's hard to say just given how much money that you can raise when you are super MAGA right now. I don't know how Trump would have dealt with anything like that. That reminds me to read this Dave Weigel tweet. He said, "This might be the worst primary night for Trump-endorsed GOP candidates all year. Burns loses narrowly in South Carolina. Dave Williams getting crushed in Colorado 5, all before the Utah Senate race comes in. And polls had showed Trump backed Trent Staggs down big. And indeed, Trent Staggs did go down to John Curtis, who ended up winning the primary for that Romney seat. We can put that up on the screen. That's B5. He was definitely not the Trump pick in the Utah race and ended up winning by double digits, 50
and Romney endorsed
30.
Curtis.
I believe Romney did endorse John Curtis. Yeah, he's like people see him as like a Romney 2.0 kind of, if that makes sense.
And I've seen political scientists say that if not for the counterfactual of Joseph Smith wandering out to Utah and creating Mormonism out there, that Utah would actually be a blue state because of if in other words, if Utah residents voted the same way as urban, suburban, and exurban voters and rural voters vote in every other state in the country, there are enough urban and suburban voters just concentrated around Salt Lake City that it would be a Democratic state. But because of Mormonism and the conservative strain in it, it's a red state, but that would also explain why it is anti-Trump and trends toward this kind of Curtis Romney style. Yeah,
the governor, Spencer Cox, is also sort of in that mold. There's a very particular type of Republican that comes from Utah, and it's not behind me right now, I just looked, but the book that's behind me sometimes is called Alienated America by Tim Carney, and Utah plays a big role in that book because it has a really high level of sort of civil society, meaning that community bonds are really tight. They have robust like Rotary clubs and all of that stuff, and it's one of the few red states that was not few. It's one of the handful of red states that was sort of ardently anti-Trump in the Republican primary, 2015, 2016. And that is an interesting point along the lines of what you were making. If you go to, rural Wisconsin, super like old Dem districts, super pro-Trump. But in states or in places where the social fabric was stronger, southeastern Wisconsin, they're pretty anti-Trump and anti-populism. So I think there's something to that about Utah in particular, but it's also hard to extricate the Mormonism from the Utahism too.
No, it's utterly impossible. And if they just solved the drinking water problem, Utah will be doing great.
Anything else? Oh, John Avalon, the CNN guy, but more importantly, I think he helped co-found No Labels. He won his primary in New York as well last night.
Staten Island or something?
Is it the George Santos seat? It's somewhere up there. No, well, maybe. It's New York's 1st district, but John Avalon.
That used to be Staten Island, yeah.
Hey, if you liked that video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to Breaking Points.
If you want to see the rest of Counterpoints, go to breakingpoints.com to become a premium member and get the full uncut show every morning in your inbox and on Spotify.